Somewhere in the quieter parts of the world, there are still buildings made of stone that have stood for nearly 1,000 years. You can find them at the end of long gravel roads, or perched on the edges of cliffs overlooking grey water, or nestled into valleys so deep that mist gathers around their lower walls like something living. Their windows are narrow, their doors are thick. Their bells, if they still ring at all, do so at hours most people never see. 3 in the morning, 4, before the sky has even begun to think about changing colour. These are monasteries, and tonight we are going to step inside them. Not the polished version, not the sanitized picture from a school textbook with robed men walking in orderly lines through peaceful gardens, faces serene, hands folded, hearts presumably at rest. That image exists, and it is not entirely false, but it is the surface of a much deeper thing. Beneath the devotion and the discipline, beneath the prayer schedules and the careful copying of holy texts, medieval monasteries were places of extraordinary complexity. They were centers of political power and economic ambition. They were libraries and breweries and hospitals and prisons. They were places where knowledge was both preserved and buried, where faith and earthly hunger existed in the same body, in the same bed, in the same narrow stone cell. There is something deeply calming about thinking of these places tonight. The weight of the stone itself, the chill of a corridor that hasn't changed in 8 centuries, the way candlelight behaves differently in a room with no electricity, no hum of appliances, no distant sound of traffic, just flame and shadow, and the slow drip of water somewhere in the dark.
The medieval monastery was a world unto itself. It had its own laws and its own rhythms. It grew its own food and made its own medicine and brewed its own ale. It produced books when books were rarer than gold. It sheltered kings on the run, and it buried secrets in its foundations that have never, in some cases, seen daylight. Monks took vows of poverty, and then managed estates that stretched for miles. They swore to silence, and then became the most sophisticated information network in Europe. They renounced the world and then shaped it from behind walls of carefully dressed stone. Tonight, we are going to walk through those walls together. We are going to move slowly through each part of this hidden world. The scriptorium, where dangerous books were copied by hand and sometimes hidden rather than shared. The infirmary, where remedies were developed from plants whose properties were kept as close as trade secrets. The undercroft, where the bones of abbots and nobles lay in the dark. The cloister, where whispered friendships formed and unspoken desires pooled in the silences between prayers. This is a story told at the pace of stone. Nothing here moves quickly. The monks themselves moved carefully, deliberately, aware that they were being watched by their abbot, by their brothers, and by a God they believed was paying close attention to every step. And so we will move with that same measured pace tonight. We are not rushing anywhere. There is nowhere to be. The bell for matins does not ring for hours yet, and the fire in the chapter house is still burning low, and the night is long, and still, and cool.
So settle yourself. Let your body find its weight against whatever is beneath you. Let your breath slow to match the rhythm of these old stone places. And know that what follows is not invented, not embellished beyond what the history holds. These are the real hidden lives of the people who built, inhabited, and sometimes escaped
the most powerful closed communities in the medieval world. We are going inside, and we are going slowly. Section 2. The Rule of Saint Benedict. A life written in whispers. Before we can understand anything about medieval monasteries, their secrets, their silences, their inner lives, we have to understand the document that governed nearly all of them. A text written sometime around the year 530, in a monastery perched on a rocky hillside in central Italy, by a man named Benedict of Nursia. It is not a long document. In its modern printed form, it runs to perhaps 70 pages. But those 70 pages shaped the interior lives of hundreds of thousands of men and women across Europe for more than 1,000 years. Benedict was born around the year 480 in a small town called Nursia, in the mountainous region of Umbria. He was educated in Rome, but what he found there, the noise, the vice, the ambition, the sheer grinding worldliness of city life, disturbed him enough that he eventually withdrew from it entirely. He went to live alone in a cave near a place called Subiaco, about 40 miles east of Rome. He stayed there for 3 years. Shepherds brought him food. He prayed. He thought. He began to understand what he believed a holy life should actually look like, stripped of the performance and politics that even the early church had already accumulated.
Eventually, other men came to him, men who also wanted to live differently. And Benedict realized that solitude, while beautiful, could not be the model for everyone. Most people needed community. They needed structure. They needed someone to tell them what to do at 3 in the morning, when their body wanted sleep and their faith demanded prayer. And so he wrote the rule. The full title in Latin is Regula Sancti Benedicti, the Rule of Saint Benedict, and its opening line, often translated as "Listen carefully, my son, to the Master's instructions, and attend to them with the ear of your heart," sets the tone immediately. This is not a document about freedom. It is a document about listening, about obedience, about the deliberate, careful surrender of individual will to a larger purpose. The rule divides the monk's day into 3 broad categories: prayer, work, and reading. The Latin phrase is ora et labora, pray and work, which became the motto of the Benedictine order, and in a sense, the motto of monastic life generally. The day was structured around 8 separate prayer offices, called the Divine Office, each occurring at a specific hour. Vigils or matins occurred around 2 or 3 in the morning. Lauds followed at dawn, then prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and finally compline, the final prayer of the day, which concluded with a blessing and sent the monks to their beds. Between these fixed points of prayer, the hours were filled with manual labour, or the slow, careful reading of scripture and sacred texts. Benedict was remarkably practical for a mystic. He specified in detail how much wine a monk should be permitted each day, roughly half a pint, though he noted that some brothers might need more and that allowances should be made. He addressed the question of what to do when monks had to travel and might be exposed to the corrupt and sinful world outside the monastery walls. He wrote about how to handle a monk who arrived late for prayer and what punishments were appropriate for different offences. He wrote about the abbot's authority, which was to be absolute, but tempered with wisdom and mercy. He even wrote about how the beds should be arranged in the dormitory and how a candle should burn through the night so that no monk was ever in complete darkness. What Benedict understood,
And this is perhaps the most interesting thing about the rule from a purely human point of view, is that people in close quarters become complicated. He knew that jealousy would grow in a monastery, that pride would grow, that desire would grow, and boredom and frustration, and the particular resentment that comes from living in a community where you cannot escape the people who irritate you most. The rule addresses all of this, not by pretending it won't happen, but by building structures around it, by giving the abbot tools to manage human frailty, by creating a rhythm so comprehensive that there is barely a moment in the day when a monk's actions are not accounted for.
The chapter on silence is particularly striking. Benedict did not demand absolute silence at all times. That would come later in stricter orders. But he elevated silence as a virtue, especially at night. After Compline, the final evening prayer, the monastery fell into what the rule called the Great Silence. No conversation, no movement unless necessary. The world contracted to the breath in your own chest and the thoughts you could not speak aloud. Imagine living inside that silence, year after year, the same stone walls, the same faces across the refectory table, the same bells pulling you from sleep before the rest of the world has stirred. There is something deeply meditative about it, and also something that requires extraordinary inner resources to sustain. Not all monks had those resources. Not all monks, as we will discover, stayed within the boundaries that Benedict had so carefully drawn. The rule spread slowly at first, then with increasing speed as the Benedictine order grew. By the 9th century, it had become the dominant form of monastic life across most of Europe. Later orders, the Cistercians, the Carthusians, the Cluniacs, modified it or created their own variations, but Benedict's framework remained the skeleton beneath all of them. The idea that a holy life required discipline, community, and a schedule, that God could be found not in dramatic visions alone, but in the patient daily repetition of prayer and work, became one of the defining ideas of medieval Christianity.
And hidden inside that framework, invisible to anyone reading the document in good faith, were 1,000 opportunities for human beings to be exactly what they had always been: complex, hungry, curious, frightened, and stubbornly themselves. The rule tried to account for everything. It could not account for everything. And in the space between what the rule commanded and what the monks actually did, the real life of the monastery unfolded. Section 3. The Hidden Architecture, Walls that Held Secrets. There is a plan. You can look at it today, reproduced in history books and framed in museum display cases. It is drawn on vellum, stretched calfskin, fine and pale, and it dates to somewhere around the years 819 to 826. It depicts an ideal monastery, designed by scholars and ecclesiastical planners associated with the scriptorium at Reichenau, an island monastery in what is now Germany. The plan was sent to the abbot of St. Gall, in what is now Switzerland, perhaps as a guide, perhaps as an aspiration. The plan of St. Gall, as it is known, shows a monastery in extraordinary detail. There is the church at the centre, naturally, large and cruciform, with apses at both ends. Surrounding it, arranged with careful geometric precision, are the cloister, the chapter house, the dormitory, the refectory, the kitchen. Farther out lie the guest house, the infirmary, the school, the abbot's house, the stables, the bakery, the brewery, the workshops, the garden. Each building is labelled. Each has a designated purpose. The whole complex is a self-contained world, designed to support a community of perhaps 110 monks and the lay brothers, servants and guests who would orbit around them.
What strikes you looking at this plan is how deliberately every space was arranged. There was no wasted room. Every corner of the monastery had a function. And yet, as monasteries were actually built and expanded over the following centuries, as abbeys grew rich and added new wings and towers and chapels and cellars, the architecture became something the plan of St. Gall could never quite anticipate. It became layered, complicated, full of spaces that accumulated history and purpose, and in some cases, deliberate concealment. The undercroft was one such space. These were the vaulted cellars that ran beneath the main buildings of a monastery, beneath the dormitory, beneath the chapel house, beneath the refectory. They were used for storage, certainly. Barrels of wine, sacks of grain, smoked meat hanging from iron hooks in the cold air. But they were also used for burial. Abbots and notable patrons were interred in the undercroft, their stone tombs arranged in rows in the near darkness below the feet of the living. To walk through a medieval undercroft today is to pass through a space where the floor itself is a kind of map of the dead, and where the air carries the particular cold of a room that has been sealed from daylight for most of its existence. The crypts that ran beneath many monastery churches were even more significant. These were not simply storage rooms or overflow burial spaces. A crypt might contain the relics of the monastery's founding saint, housed in elaborate shrines of gold and silver and gemstone. Access was carefully controlled. Not every monk had the right to enter. Pilgrims were sometimes permitted, in limited numbers, to descend into the crypt and approach the shrine, but only under supervision and only by certain routes. The most sacred spaces were entirely off-limits to lay people, screened behind locked gates whose keys were held by the sacrist, one of the most trusted officers of the monastery. Hidden passages and concealed rooms are the stuff of legend when it comes to monasteries, and legend has a way of exceeding reality. But it is also true that real, verifiable concealed spaces have been found in medieval monastic buildings. Some were designed for practical purposes, secret stairs connecting the dormitory to the church so monks could descend for the night offices without using the main cloister in bad weather. Some were clearly designed for concealment. At certain English abbeys, small chambers behind altar screens or beneath floor slabs have been discovered that are too small to be burial vaults and too concealed to be storage. Rooms that may have hidden valuables or manuscripts, or in the most dramatic cases, people. The chapter house was the monastery's court, the room where the whole community gathered each morning after lauds to hear a chapter of the rule read aloud, which is where the name came from, to conduct the business of the day and to administer discipline. Monks who had committed faults confessed them here in front of their brothers and received their penances. It was a space of deliberate transparency. And yet the walls of chapter houses frequently concealed things: bones of abbots built into the masonry, vaults beneath the floor that held documents and charters and title deeds that the monastery needed to protect against fire, flood, or the attentions of hostile neighbors. The rear dorter, a word that simply means behind the dormitory, was the monastic toilet block, a long room built over a channel of running water, lined with seats. It sounds unglamorous, and it was, but it was also one of the few spaces in a monastery where a monk might have something approaching genuine privacy. The rule said that monks should never be alone, that even in sleep the dormitory should be lit so that all could see each other. The rear dorter was the rare exception, and in that exception things happened that the rule did not intend. Conversations were held, objects were passed.
In at least one documented case at a medieval English monastery, correspondence was discovered hidden in the wall cavity near the rear door, letters that should not have existed between a monk and the outside world.
The garden, too, was more than a garden. The cloister garth, the square of green at the heart of the monastery, enclosed on all sides by the covered walkways, was technically a place of reading and meditation. Monks were permitted to walk there, to sit on the low stone benches, to read. But it was also the space where the observable life of the monastery was most easily conducted away from the abbot's direct gaze, where glances were exchanged, where whispers were possible, where the human need for informal contact, for conversation that was not religious, for friendship that was not officially approved, found its outlet in the shade of the cloister arches. The monastery was designed to be transparent, every monk visible to every other monk, the abbot able to observe and correct and guide. The rule enforced this watchfulness as a spiritual discipline. You were never truly alone, and the awareness of being seen was meant to keep you on the path. But buildings, like people, are imperfect, and in the imperfect spaces of a medieval monastery, in the corner behind the night stairs, in the cellar behind the barrels, in the corridor that connected the infirmary to the herb garden, the hidden life of the institution breathed quietly on. Section 4. The Scriptorium. Forbidden Knowledge on Vellum.
The scriptorium was not always a single room. In many monasteries, particularly in the early centuries, before abbeys grew wealthy enough to dedicate separate buildings to specific purposes, it was simply a table, or a corner, or a space in the cloister where the light was good and the wind did not blow too fiercely through the open arches. A monk sat down with his tools, a goose quill trimmed and split with a small knife, a pot of ink mixed from ingredients that might include oak galls, iron salts, gum arabic, and water, a flat piece of parchment prepared from the stretched and scraped skin of a sheep or calf, sometimes so thin that light passed through it like paper, and he wrote. The work was slow, agonizingly slow. A single book, a copy of the Psalms or the Gospels or a theological commentary, might take a single scribe a year to complete. A larger work might take several years. The scribe sat in conditions that ranged from uncomfortable to actively hostile. In winter, northern European monasteries were deeply cold, and cold is the enemy of fine work. Ink thickened, fingers stiffened, the vellum contracted. One 10th century monk left a note in the margin of a manuscript he was copying, a note that was not meant to be part of the text, just a private complaint, that translates roughly as cold and ill and freezing. Other marginal notes, which scholars sometimes call colophons or marginalia, record the date, the scribe's name, his exhaustion, his relief at finishing, his prayers that the reader would remember him kindly. One writes, "As the sailor longs for port, so does the scribe for the last line." These small human voices, preserved by accident in the margins of sacred texts, are among the most quietly moving things that survive from the Middle Ages. But the scriptorium was not only a place of preservation and copying, it was also a place of selection. And selection, in a world where information was scarce and the church held enormous authority over what was considered true and what was considered dangerous, was an act of considerable power.
Monasteries controlled access to books in a way that is difficult for us to fully imagine today, when the entirety of recorded human knowledge is available on a device that fits in your pocket. In the medieval world, a monastery's library was often the only library for hundreds of miles. The abbot, or the monk designated as the librarian, often called the armarius, decided which books could be read freely, which could be consulted only under supervision, and which were to be locked away entirely. The books deemed too dangerous for general circulation were typically texts that touched on subjects the Church viewed with suspicion, certain classical philosophical works that contained ideas incompatible with Christian doctrine, texts on astrology or alchemy or natural magic, and occasionally, in cases that required particular care, theological works by writers who had since been condemned as heretics. What happened to these locked-away books varied. Some were simply chained to their shelves, the famous chained libraries of medieval England and Europe, where books were attached by iron chains to their reading desks so they could be consulted in place but never removed, represent a kind of institutional anxiety about books escaping into the wrong hands. The chain was both a security measure and a statement. This knowledge is here, and it is controlled. The library at Hereford Cathedral, which still exists today and is open to visitors, retains its chained books. Walking among them is an experience that feels like entering a conversation about power and knowledge that is still, in some ways, unfinished. Other books were hidden more completely. The monastery at Monte Cassino in Italy, the very monastery that Benedict of Nursia founded in approximately 529, was one of the great repositories of ancient knowledge in the medieval world. Monks there copied texts from the classical world that would otherwise have been lost entirely. Works of Cicero, Virgil, Tacitus, Apuleius. But they did not always copy everything. Some texts were considered too pagan, too sexually explicit, too philosophically subversive. These were sometimes destroyed. Sometimes they were simply set aside in a part of the library that was not generally accessible. And in a few documented cases, they were copied because the monastic impulse toward preservation was often stronger than the impulse toward censorship, but copied with warnings appended, or with particular passages left out, or with marginal annotations indicating that this section should not be read by novices or lay brothers. The marginalia left by medieval scribes are their own kind of forbidden text. Alongside the careful religious copying, monks drew in the margins of their manuscripts things that no official religious document was supposed to contain. Animals playing musical instruments, grotesque hybrid creatures with human heads and animal bodies, knights doing battle with giant snails, which appears so frequently in medieval manuscript margins that it has become one of the great puzzles of medieval art history. Nobody is entirely sure what the snails represent. There are monks depicted in the margins, behaving in ways that violated the rule. There are small, careful drawings that appear to be portraits. There are mathematical puzzles, fragments of song, notes in vernacular languages rather than Latin, all of these representing the private interior of a scribe's mind, leaking out around the edges of the sacred text he was supposed to be reproducing faithfully. The information network that monasteries represented was also a kind of secret infrastructure. As one historical account of monastic communication notes, monks could travel under the cover of pilgrimage or ecclesiastical duty, crossing borders without suspicion. Monastic guest houses and the strict rules of hospitality that required monasteries to shelter all travellers made abbeys natural relay stations for information, news, rumours, political intelligence, personal messages that could be collected and passed on without attracting the attention that a purely secular messenger might draw. There are records of coded letters passing between monasteries, concealed in the physical structure of the manuscripts themselves.
the coloured inks used in illuminated manuscripts, the geometric patterns of decorated borders. These were, in some cases, more than decoration. They were systems of communication between people who needed to share information that could not safely be written in plain text.
The scriptorium, in other words, was not merely a room for the patient reproduction of holy texts. It was a room where the boundaries of permitted knowledge were negotiated daily in ink and vellum, where the tension between preservation and censorship played out in the small decisions of individual scribes who held quills in cold fingers and decided word by word what the future would be allowed to know. Section 5. The Cellarium. Wine, ale, and earthly pleasures. There is a persistent image of the medieval monk as someone who denied himself pleasure, who ate plain food and drank water, and felt no particular regret about it, who found joy in prayer alone, and who regarded the body's appetites as obstacles to spiritual progress rather than as simple facts of being human. This image is, to put it gently, incomplete. Monasteries were breweries. Some of the finest and most complex alcoholic beverages in the history of Europe were developed, refined, and produced within monastic walls. The brewing of ale and the production of wine were not sideline activities, occasional indulgences tolerated by a lenient abbot. They were central economic and daily functions of the monastery, managed with the same care and attention to craft that the monks brought to illuminating manuscripts or tending the sick.
The cellarer was one of the most important offices in a Benedictine monastery. The Rule of Saint Benedict dedicates an entire chapter to describing who the cellarer should be and what qualities he should possess. He should be, Benedict writes, like a father to the whole community, wise and mature and not given to excess. He should manage the monastery's food, drink, and material stores with prudence and generosity. He should keep accurate accounts. He should not refuse requests from monks in a harsh or dismissive way. He was, in effect, the monastery's chief of provisions, and among the provisions he managed, wine and ale occupied a prominent place. Benedict himself, in the Rule, addressed the question of wine with characteristic practicality. He noted that wine was not really appropriate for monks at all, citing the Apostle Paul's exhortation to abstinence, but acknowledged that in his own era it was impossible to convince monks of this. And so he allowed a daily ration, roughly half a pint of wine per monk per day, which by modern standards seems modest, but by the standards of medieval nutrition was a meaningful caloric contribution. He added, and this is the detail that reveals the kind of person he was, that he was ashamed to be setting any limit at all, but that the weakness of the sick should be accommodated, and that brothers who could abstain should know they would receive a special reward from God. In practice, the allowances were often rather more generous than the rules strictly required. Feast days, of which there were many in the medieval liturgical calendar, were occasions for expanded provisions. The abbot could, and often did, authorize additional servings for the community on these occasions. And the principle of hospitality, which required monasteries to feed and shelter any guest without question or charge, meant that the cellarium was a place of fairly constant activity, producing not just for the community, but for the steady stream of pilgrims, travellers, noble patrons, and ecclesiastical visitors who moved through the monastery's guesthouse. The brewing of ale was even more universal than the production of wine. In northern Europe, where grapes did not grow reliably, ale was the primary beverage for everyone, from peasants to kings. Water was not always safe to drink, contaminated wells and rivers were a constant threat, and ale, which was boiled during its production,
was substantially safer. Monks brewed ale on a considerable scale. The monastery at St. Gall, the same institution for which that famous architectural plan was drawn up, had a brewery of such size that it has been studied extensively by historians of medieval technology. The plan itself shows not one, but 3 separate brewing facilities within the monastery complex, designed to produce ale of different qualities. One for the monks, one for distinguished guests, and one for the pilgrims and poorer visitors.
Monastic brewers were not simply following recipes. They were experimenting. They were adapting. They had access to knowledge of plants and herbs that most secular brewers did not, because the same gardens that produced medicinal herbs also produced flavoring agents for ale. Hops, which eventually became the dominant flavoring in beer, were cultivated in monastic gardens from an early period. But before hops became standard, monastic brewers used a mixture of herbs called grute, which could include yarrow, wild rosemary, sweet gale, and a variety of other plants, some of which had mild psychoactive properties that went rather beyond simple flavoring. The exact composition of grute was often a closely guarded local secret, and monasteries that controlled the supply of grute could profit from it significantly. The wine culture of medieval monasteries was even more sophisticated. Certain monasteries in France and Germany became the centers of viticulture, grape cultivation, and wine production in their regions, developing techniques for managing vineyards, selecting grape varieties, and aging wine that formed the foundation of the modern wine industry. The Cistercians, a reformed Benedictine order founded in 1098, were particularly influential in this regard. Their Abbey of Citeaux in Burgundy and the many Cistercian houses that spread across France and Germany in the 12th and 13th centuries controlled some of the most productive and important vineyards in Europe. The Clos de Vougeot in Burgundy, one of the most famous wine-producing plots in the world, was originally a Cistercian vineyard, and the wall that still surrounds it was built by the monks.
Beyond wine and ale, the monastery's provisions included an enormous variety of food that contradicted the simple diet the rule implied. The rule prohibited meat on most days, but fish was permitted, and monasteries with access to rivers or fish ponds, which most large monasteries maintained deliberately, had a reliable supply. The prohibition on meat had an interesting loophole. The rule referred to the meat of 4-footed beasts, which some interpreters took to mean that birds were acceptable. This creative reading led to the development of highly refined poultry dishes in certain wealthy monasteries. The infirmary had its own kitchen and its own relaxed standards, since the sick were officially exempt from the stricter dietary rules. This meant that a monk who was genuinely unwell, or who happened to be friends with the infirmarian, might find himself eating rather better than the rule intended. The cellarium was, in the end, a place that told the truth about monastic life more honestly than the scriptorium or the chapel. It held not the aspirations of the monastery, but its physical reality: the grain, the barrels, the smoked fish, the root vegetables stored against the winter, the carefully labelled crocks of preserved fruit and pickled herbs. It smelled of fermentation and earth and cold stone. It was tended by monks who knew their community's appetite well, and who understood that a community kept from all earthly pleasure was a community that would eventually fracture. The food and drink of the monastery were not concessions to weakness. They were the oil that kept the mechanism running.
There is a garden that no longer exists, but that historians and archaeologists have reconstructed with considerable care. It belonged to the monastery of St. Gall. It was called the Herbularius, or the Physic Garden,
and it occupied a rectangular space near the infirmary, divided into neat raised beds. In those beds grew approximately 16 species of medicinal plants, each labelled on the plan of St. Gall with its Latin name: costmary, fenugreek, rosemary, pennyroyal, mint, sage, rue, iris, lovage, watercress, lily, savory, fennel, tansy, cumin, and one more at the end of the list, identified only as a bean. This garden was not decorative. It was functional in the most urgent sense. It was a pharmacy, the primary source of treatments for illness in a community of people who could not simply walk to a shop or call a physician. The monk who tended the infirmary, typically called the infirmarian, was responsible for the care of sick monks, elderly monks, and any guests of the monastery who fell ill during their stay. His tools were the plants of that garden, the texts of classical medicine preserved in the library, and the accumulated practical knowledge of generations of monastic healers before him.
Medieval monastic medicine has sometimes been dismissed as superstition dressed up in clerical robes, prayers and herbal poultices, and nothing more. This is a misunderstanding that does considerable injustice to what the monks actually achieved. The foundations of their medical practice were the classical texts of the ancient world, the works of Hippocrates and Galen, the pharmacological writings of Dioscorides, the medical encyclopedia of Isidore of Seville. These texts, which might have been entirely lost during the chaotic centuries of the early Middle Ages, the period of migrations, invasions, and the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, survived precisely because monasteries preserved and copied them. The Benedictines of Monte Cassino were particularly important in this regard. Their scriptorium produced copies of ancient medical texts that became the foundation of medical education in Europe. The monastery at Salerno in southern Italy was associated with what eventually became the first genuine medical school in Europe, the Scola Medica Salernitana, and its curriculum drew heavily on the ancient texts that monks had kept alive.
But monastic medicine was not merely bookish. The infirmarian learned by doing, and what the doing taught him was often well ahead of what the books described. Monks in remote locations had to deal with medical emergencies with whatever was at hand: fractures, wounds from accidents in the fields or workshops, infections, fevers, childbirth complications among women from the surrounding community who came to the monastery's hospital, chronic conditions of the elderly monks who could no longer maintain the full rigor of the rule. They developed empirical knowledge about which plants worked for which conditions, knowledge that was sometimes different from what the ancient texts recorded, because the plants of northern Europe were not always the same as the plants described by Mediterranean authors. The physic garden of a well-equipped monastery might contain dozens of species: lavender for headaches and anxiety, valerian, whose sedative properties were well understood, for sleep disorders, and the monks, given their interrupted sleep schedule, were presumably in regular need of it; willow bark, which contains salicin, the chemical precursor to aspirin, for pain and fever; elderberries for respiratory illness; wormwood for intestinal parasites; St. John's wort, which monks cultivated widely and used for everything from wound healing to melancholy.
The secrecy surrounding some of these remedies was real and intentional. A monastery that had developed a particularly effective treatment for a common ailment had an advantage, both in terms of the reputation that attracted wealthy patients and benefactors, and in terms of the direct income that came from selling preparations to those outside the monastery walls. The pharmacy at Camaldoli, the Benedictine monastery founded east of Florence in the 11th century, was referenced in documents as early as 1048.
By the 16th century, its botanical garden was well stocked, and its preparations were in demand throughout the region. The formulas for those preparations were not freely shared. They belonged to the monastery's intellectual and economic patrimony, in the same way that the vineyard formulas belonged to the Cistercians of Burgundy. The infirmary itself was a complex of spaces, a ward for the sick, separated from the main monastery so that illness did not spread through the community, a kitchen for preparing special invalid diets, a bathroom where the sick could be bathed more frequently than the rule normally permitted, and a small chapel or oratory attached so that patients could hear Mass without leaving their beds. In a well-endowed monastery, the infirmary might rival a small hospital in its sophistication, with individual cells for each patient, a garden for convalescents to walk in, and a staff of infirmarians experienced in a wide range of treatments. The more troubling aspects of monastic medicine are also worth noting. The boundary between herbal medicine and what the Church technically considered magic or forbidden knowledge was not always clearly drawn. Certain plants, opium poppies for instance, whose properties were well understood, occupied an ambiguous space. Surgeons in the medieval world used preparations made from a combination of plants, including opium, henbane, and hemlock, to render patients unconscious for procedures that would otherwise be impossible to perform. These preparations were powerful, dangerous, and not freely discussed. Their formulas were among the most carefully guarded secrets in a monastery's medical knowledge. Then there were the remedies that drew on an older tradition than Christianity, the folk knowledge of herbs and their properties that had been gathered by healers across Europe long before the Church arrived and reorganized everything. Monks who grew up in rural communities brought that knowledge with them into the monastery. It mixed quietly and sometimes uncomfortably with the officially sanctioned classical medicine of the texts. The result was a body of practical knowledge that was richer and stranger than either source alone, and that the monastery, with its walls and its rules about what could and could not be discussed openly, did not always broadcast to the wider world. Then there were Section 7, the cloister garth, whispered sins, and secret vows.
The cloister walk was a covered corridor, typically about 10 feet wide, that ran along the inner sides of a square enclosure. Above you was a stone vault or a timber roof. Beside you, on the inner side, a series of arches opened onto the garth, the square of grass or garden at the cloister's center. On the outer side, the solid wall of the monastery's main buildings, the church to the north, the chapter house to the east, the refectory to the south, the cellarium or lay brothers' quarters to the west. The floor was stone, worn smooth by centuries of sandaled feet moving around the same path at the same hours of every day. The cloister was many things simultaneously. It was a passageway that connected the monastery's main buildings, allowing monks to move between them in all weathers without going outside. It was a place of reading. Benches were set at intervals along the walks, and monks were permitted to sit here with their books during the hours assigned to Lectio Divina, the slow, meditative reading of sacred texts that was as important to the Benedictine rule as prayer or manual labor. It was a place of controlled circulation. In a monastery where monks were not supposed to be alone and not supposed to be idle, the cloister provided a monitored space for movement and quiet activity. But the cloister was also, inescapably, the space where the interior life of the community was most visibly expressed. The faces passing in the covered walkways day after day, year after year. The eyes that met or avoided meeting, the small gestures of acknowledgement or resentment, the complex emotional weather of a closed community. All of this played out in the cloister in ways that were never intended but were entirely inevitable. The interior life of a medieval monk has left traces in the documentary record that are more revealing than the official documents would suggest. Monastic visitations, inspections conducted by bishops or abbots general who had authority over individual houses, produced records that are, in their way, extraordinary historical documents. They record, in the dry language of ecclesiastical administration, the private failures and private griefs of communities of men and women living under enormous psychological pressure. The complaints were varied. At some monasteries, the visitors found monks who had accumulated private property, coins hidden under mattresses, small personal items stored in locked boxes, in violation of the vow of poverty. At others, they found evidence of conflict so deep and so personal that the community could barely function. Monks who refused to speak to each other, factional divisions that ran along lines of social class or regional origin, senior monks who tyrannized juniors in ways that the abbot either could not see or did not wish to address.
The question of celibacy is the one that attracts the most attention, and the record here is genuinely complex. The formal requirement of celibacy, the absolute prohibition on sexual relationships, was one of the most psychologically demanding aspects of monastic life. It was also one of the most frequently violated, at least according to the records of visitations and the complaints brought before ecclesiastical courts. At the monasteries inspected by Thomas Cromwell's commissioners in England in the 1530s, admittedly in a context where the commissioners were specifically looking for evidence of corruption to justify Henry VIII's dissolution program, reports came back of monks with female companions, of monks who had fathered children, of monks whose private lives bore very little resemblance to the rule's demands. But these extreme cases are only the most visible end of a much broader spectrum of human experience. The emotional reality of monastic life for most monks was something quieter and more sustained. The slow management of loneliness, the negotiation of close friendships that were always under the shadow of official suspicion, the experience of loving people you were not supposed to love in the ways you felt inclined to.
The concept of particular friendships, what the Latin sources called amicitia specialis, was deeply controversial in medieval monastic thought. Writers of the period understood perfectly well that monks formed intense emotional bonds with one another. The question was whether those bonds were spiritually beneficial or spiritually dangerous. Benedict's rule was relatively permissive on the subject of friendship, treating it as a natural human need that should be managed rather than extirpated. But later writers, particularly in the stricter Reformed orders, viewed particular friendships with considerable suspicion, as potential entrances for the kinds of attachment that the monastery was supposed to have transcended. The emotional richness of monastic life, the love and grief and jealousy and longing that circulated through those covered walkways, found expression in unexpected places. In the letters that monks wrote to one another, which survive in remarkable numbers and reveal a world of feeling that the official documents entirely suppress. In the small personalized decorations that individual monks added to manuscripts they illuminated, a tiny face in the margin that historians suspect is a portrait of someone the scribe cared about. In the prayers composed for specific individuals, asking for God's mercy on a named person whose loss has clearly left a wound the official vocabulary of monastic faith could not quite contain. The cloister held all of this, the official life and the hidden life, walking the same path in opposite directions, meeting in the corners where the arches turned. Section 8. The Undercroft. What lay beneath the monastery.
Go down.
That is always the direction in which the oldest things are found. In a medieval monastery, the direction downward meant the undercroft, a word that comes from the Old English and simply means beneath the vault. These were the spaces under the main buildings, supported by the same thick stone pillars and rounded arches that the Romanesque style brought to religious architecture, built to last for centuries and to carry the weight of everything above them. The undercroft had many uses, and different monasteries assigned it different functions depending on their size, their wealth, and what they needed to store or protect. In the great English Cistercian abbeys, Fountains, Revaulx, Tintern, Kirkstore, the undercrofts were enormous, running the entire length of the dormitory range above. Vaulted in long bays that created a sequence of dim spaces that were cool in summer and cold in winter, ideal for storing the produce of the monastery's extensive agricultural holdings. Wine, grain, wool, salted meat, dried fish, the material wealth of a community that in its peak years might be managing thousands of acres of farmland and hundreds of dependent workers.
But the undercroft was also a place of the dead. Burial within the monastery was a privilege, not a right, and it was one that wealthy patrons paid for generously. To be buried within the walls of a monastery, in the proximity of its saints and its accumulating prayers, was believed to confer spiritual benefits on the deceased, benefits that could not be obtained from a simple churchyard grave outside the walls. Abbots and priors were buried in the most prestigious positions, often in the chapter house, in the church itself, or in dedicated chapels. But minor benefactors, important patrons, and distinguished guests who died while visiting a monastery might be interred in the undercroft, their stone-carved effigies gradually disappearing under layers of accumulating time, and occasionally, quite literally, under the floorboards of later construction. The bones beneath a medieval monastery are, in the most straightforward sense, numerous. A community that has been functioning for 300 years in the same location, burying its members and its benefactors in the same precinct, accumulates the dead in layers. Modern archaeological investigations of monastic sites have uncovered these layers in impressive detail. At the site of Blackfriars in London, excavations have found burials stacked several feet deep in some areas. At Whitefriars in Norwich, the same. The medieval monastery was built on the literal remains of everyone who had preceded it. Some of these remains were not simply buried, but enshrined. The relics of a monastery's patron saint, if it was fortunate enough to have them, were kept in the most elaborate containers the community could afford. Reliquaries of gold and silver, decorated with jewels and enamel, sometimes in the shape of the body part they contained. A finger bone in a golden finger, a skull in a crystal globe mounted in silver. These relics were among the monastery's most valuable possessions, both spiritually and economically, because they attracted pilgrims, and pilgrims brought offerings. The crypt beneath the church was where the most important relics were kept, in conditions of controlled access and careful ceremony. What was less openly acknowledged was the degree to which the relics themselves were sometimes of dubious authenticity. The medieval relic trade was enormous, and the monasteries that sat along major pilgrimage routes had both the motive and the means to acquire impressive collections. The acquisition was not always straightforward. Relics were bought and sold, stolen and traded. They were sometimes manufactured, the bones of saints who had never existed, authenticated by documents that were themselves forgeries. The cathedral at Cologne claimed to possess the bones of the three magi, the wise men from the Nativity story, in a reliquary that is still one of the great works of medieval goldsmithery. The bones were real,
Whether they belong to anyone present at the birth of Christ is a question the medieval church would have found impious, and the modern historian would call unanswerable.
The practice of relic forgery was an open secret in the medieval world. Theologians complained about it. Satirists mocked it. Chaucer's pardoner in the Canterbury Tales carries relics that are plainly fake. A pillowcase he claims is Our Lady's veil. A piece of pig's bone he claims worked miracles. The pardoner is a satirical figure, not a documentary one, but he represents a real and widely recognized problem. Monasteries that had genuine, well-documented relics were enormously advantaged. Those that did not had powerful incentives to acquire something impressive by whatever means were available. In the darkness of the undercroft, among the barrels and the stone tombs, the boundary between the sacred and the commercial was sometimes very thin. Section 9. Relics, Forgeries, and Sacred Deceptions. In the year 828 or thereabouts, a group of Venetian merchants arrived in Alexandria, which was at that time under Arab rule. They sought out 2 Greek monks at a local church, and after some negotiation, they arranged to take from that church the remains of the Apostle Mark, one of the 4 evangelists, the author of the second Gospel, the patron saint of lions and of scribes. They concealed the remains under layers of cabbages and salted pork, knowing that the Arab customs officials would not want to handle pork, and smuggled them out of the city. The body of St. Mark was then transported to Venice, where it was received with enormous ceremony and installed in a new basilica built specifically for it. That basilica is now called St. Mark's Basilica, and it remains one of the most important churches in the world. This is not a story from the fringes of medieval Christian practice. It is from the mainstream. The theft of relics, sometimes called translatio in Latin, literally translation or carrying across, was considered acceptable, even praiseworthy, if the saint whose remains were being moved approved of the action, which approval could be inferred from the absence of divine punishment during the operation. If you got away with it, God had permitted it. If you were caught, God had not. The moral framework was entirely circular, and it served very conveniently to justify a trade in human remains that operated across the medieval centuries on a scale that seems almost incomprehensible today. Every significant monastery wanted relics. The more impressive the saint, the better. A fragment of the true cross, the wood on which Christ was crucified, was the ultimate prize, and the number of such fragments distributed across Europe was famously enormous. John Calvin, writing in the 16th century as part of his Protestant critique of Catholic practice, calculated with evident sarcasm that if all the fragments of the true cross claimed by various churches and monasteries were assembled together, they would fill a large ship. This was an exaggeration, but the point was recognized as having real force. The relic market had produced more fragments of the true cross than one cross could possibly have contained. The economic dimension of the relic trade was central and largely undisguised. Monasteries built their entire financial model around the pilgrimage traffic that important relics attracted. Pilgrims came, they made offerings at the shrine, they bought ampullae, small flasks of water or oil that had been in contact with the relics, to take home as souvenirs and secondary relics in their own right. They paid messes to be said for the souls of their family members. They donated to the fabric of the church. A monastery with a genuinely popular shrine could be wealthy beyond the dreams of most secular institutions. Canterbury Cathedral, which contained the shrine of Thomas Becket, murdered there in 1170, generated offerings on a scale that made it one of the richest institutions in England for the following 3.5 centuries, until Henry VIII's commissioners arrived at Havers in 1538 and destroyed the shrine,
removing cartloads of gold, jewels, and precious objects.
The production of fraudulent relics was not conducted openly, but it was not exactly hidden either. Everyone in the medieval church, from the most elevated cardinal to the most junior novice, understood that the authentication of relics was an imperfect process. Bishops and councils issued rulings periodically about how relics should be verified. The Church required that relics be accompanied by documentation, a certificate from the bishop of the diocese where the saint had lived and died, testifying to the authenticity of the remains. But documentation could be forged. Documents were forged regularly throughout the medieval period. The technology of forgery, close familiarity with the conventions of official documents, access to older parchment, skill with ink and calligraphy, was, by a certain dark irony, most available to the people most likely to need it, monks, who were both the primary producers of official documents and the primary consumers of relics. The monastery of Glastonbury in Somerset presents one of the most elaborate and well-documented cases of what might politely be called creative historical construction. In the year 1191, the monks of Glastonbury announced that they had discovered, in the monastery's burial ground, the bodies of King Arthur and Queen Guinevere. They had, conveniently, been guided to the location by a vision, and the grave had conveniently been marked with a leaden cross bearing an inscription. Here lies buried the famous King Arthur, with Guinevere his second wife, in the island of Avalon. The monastery at Glastonbury had burned down in 1184 and was in serious need of funds for reconstruction. The discovery of Arthur's tomb brought pilgrims, offerings, and royal patronage pouring in.
Historians have debated this case for centuries. The general scholarly consensus today is that the discovery was almost certainly staged, that the cross was manufactured and the grave arranged to be found. But the monks of Glastonbury were not simply cynical fraudsters. They operated within a world that genuinely believed that the physical remains of the holy and the heroic retained spiritual power. A world that needed its sacred places and its sacred stories that would come to them if they existed, and that the monks were, in their own minds, perhaps simply helping along. The distance between sincere belief and deliberate deception is harder to measure in faith-saturated contexts than it is from the outside. The undercroft, the crypt, the locked reliquary cabinet, these were the spaces where the line between the sacred and the entrepreneurial dissolved into something more complicated than either word alone could capture. Section 10. The Forbidden Library. Books chained and locked away. A chained library is exactly what it sounds like. The books are real, bound in leather and wooden boards, their pages made of vellum or, in later examples, paper. They sit on slanted reading desks arranged in rows, and from the back of each book, attached to the binding near the spine, a chain extends. The chain is made of iron links. Each link may be half an inch across. It runs from the book to a rod along the front edge of the reading desk, where it terminates in a ring that slides along the rod. The book can be lifted from the desk, pulled toward the reader, turned to any page, but it cannot be taken away. It is, in the most literal sense, a prisoner of its shelf. The Hereford Cathedral Library in England contains perhaps the finest surviving example of a chained library in the world. Over 220 books remain chained to their original desks in a room that has been serving this purpose since 1611, though the practice of chaining began much earlier. Walking through it feels like entering the mind of an institution that loved knowledge enough to preserve it meticulously and feared it enough to bind it in iron. The impulse to chain books to their shelves was not paranoia, it was realism. Books were extraordinarily valuable in the medieval world. A large illuminated manuscript might represent months or years of skilled labor, and the materials alone were costly. The vellum required the skins of dozens of animals. The gold used in illuminated letters was real gold, applied as leaf or as a ground pigment. A single large Bible could represent the equivalent of a year's income for the monastery that produced it. Theft was a genuine concern, and not only from outside the walls. Monks who were allowed to borrow books from the library sometimes failed to return them. Visiting scholars sometimes helped themselves to volumes they particularly wanted. The chain was the simplest possible solution to a problem that the community had tried to address through rules and record-keeping before giving up and resorting to iron.
But the chaining of books was also, at a deeper level, a statement about the relationship between knowledge and authority. Not all books were chained equally. The most common texts, service books, copies of the rule, widely circulated theological works, were left accessible to any member of the community who needed them. The books that were chained were typically those of particular value or particular sensitivity. And in the locked cases and sealed alcoves of certain monastic libraries, behind the accessible collection, there were books that were not merely chained, but actively concealed. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books, was not formally established by the Roman Catholic Church until 1559, but the principle of prohibited books was far older. Throughout the medieval period, the Church identified texts that it considered dangerous to Orthodox faith and directed that they should not be made available to general readers. The writings of condemned heretics, Cathar theology, Waldensian texts, later the works of Wycliffe and Huss, were to be destroyed if found. They were not always destroyed. Some copies survived in the libraries of monasteries whose abbots were either too curious or too cautious about destroying any written work to comply fully with the destruction orders. The texts that walked the boundary of permitted knowledge, most interestingly, were those dealing with natural philosophy, astrology, and what the Church broadly categorized as the magical arts. Astrology occupied an ambiguous position in medieval Christian thought. On one hand, it was a classical discipline, associated with the learned traditions of Greece and Rome, and certain forms of astrological calculation were considered perfectly acceptable, predicting the weather, calculating the dates of Easter and other movable feasts, understanding the influence of celestial bodies on human health. On the other hand, astrological prediction of the kind that claimed to forecast individual human futures was considered to threaten the doctrine of free will, and therefore to be suspect at best and heretical at worst. Alchemical texts were similarly ambiguous. The dream of transmuting base metals into gold, which is what most people understand by alchemy, was clearly a worldly ambition incompatible with monastic poverty. But alchemy was also a sophisticated natural philosophy that dealt with the transformation of matter in general, and its texts overlapped substantially with the legitimate medical and chemical knowledge that monasteries needed. Some alchemical manuscripts were kept in monastic libraries without apparent difficulty. Others were copied into compilations of natural history alongside perfectly orthodox material, as if the compiler hoped that proximity to respectability would sanitize them.
The books that monasteries kept locked away in chests, in sealed presses, in rooms that only the armarius could open, represented the places where institutional knowledge exceeded institutional permission. where what the monks knew or suspected about the world pressed against the limits of what the Church allowed them to know officially. These were the libraries within the library, the thought behind the thought. And in some monasteries they were guarded with the same devotion as the relics, perhaps because they represented, in their own way, the most sacred thing of all, the desire to understand. Section 11. Political intrigue behind the cloister walls. A monastery was, by definition, a withdrawal from the world. The men and women who entered its walls had formally renounced their secular identity, their family obligations, their place in the hierarchy of the world outside. They belonged now to a community ordered by a different logic, under a different authority, pursuing a different purpose. The wall that surrounded the monastery was not merely architectural. It was a declaration: this place is not the world. And yet the world constantly climbed over that wall. Medieval monasteries were among the most politically significant institutions in Europe, and this was not despite their religious character, but in large part because of it. The wealth they accumulated from land grants, bequests, tithes, and pilgrimage income made them major economic actors. Their control of libraries and literate personnel, in an age when literacy was rare enough to be a form of power in itself, made them indispensable to secular rulers who needed educated administrators. Their status as sacred spaces, exempt from many of the obligations and interventions that secular authority could impose on ordinary properties, made them natural refuges for people who needed to disappear from the political landscape for a while. Kings fled to monasteries. This was not metaphorical. Dethroned kings, kings on the run from rivals, kings who had decided that the most effective survival strategy was to exchange their crown for a cowl, all found their way to monastic houses. The practice was so common that medieval political theorists had to develop a fairly sophisticated body of thought about whether a king who had taken monastic vows could later renounce them and reclaim his throne. The answer varied depending on who was doing the theorizing and what political outcome they needed. Edgar the Peaceful, King of the English in the 10th century, had sons educated in monasteries. Henry II of England, guilty of the murder of Thomas Becket, performed public penance at Canterbury Cathedral. Richard II of England was effectively imprisoned, then murdered, while Edward IV of England was temporarily displaced and took refuge with Cistercian monks in Flanders during the Wars of the Roses in 1470. The monastery, as a place of refuge, was not limited to kings. Political enemies who needed to be removed from circulation without being killed, a sometimes difficult balance for medieval rulers who understood that martyrdom could be more politically inconvenient than the living opposition it eliminated, could be persuaded or forced into a monastery. A noble who had backed the wrong side in a civil war might find himself handed a monk's habit and shown to a cell. He was alive. He was safe in a certain sense. He was entirely out of the political picture. And if he was sufficiently important, his monastery might serve as a node in the information network that connected political exiles, informers, and interested parties across national boundaries. The abbots who ran these institutions were themselves significant political figures. The great abbots of the medieval period, men like Anselm of Bec, who became Archbishop of Canterbury, Bernard of Clairvaux, whose influence over the papacy and the Crusades was immeasurable, Suger of Saint-Denis, who effectively ran France during the absence of Louis VII on crusade, were not mere spiritual directors. They were statesmen, diplomats, propagandists, and in some cases generals. The abbot's authority within his monastery was absolute,
but his ambition often extended far beyond it.
The political intrigue that circulated within monastery walls was sometimes as elaborate as anything in a secular court. Abbatial elections, the process by which a new abbot was chosen following the death of his predecessor, were frequently contentious affairs, with factions forming around different candidates, external pressure applied by diocesan bishops or secular lords who wanted a candidate loyal to their interests, and occasional outright fraud in the counting of votes. The records of disputed elections fill many pages of medieval episcopal registers, and they reveal communities in which the spiritual and the worldly were thoroughly entangled. Monasteries also served as archives, the primary repositories for documents of legal and historical significance in their regions. Land grants, royal charters, legal records, genealogical documents, all of these were held in the monastery's archive, which was both safer and more permanent than anything a secular institution of the period could offer. This made the monastery an essential partner for secular rulers who needed their legal title to land and authority to be preserved and attested, and it gave the monastery leverage. An archive is a form of power. Knowing where the documents are and who has access to them is a position of real and lasting influence.
The monastery was also a natural vehicle for espionage, as one historical source notes. Monks could travel under the cover of pilgrimage or ecclesiastical duty, crossing borders that would have been more carefully watched for obviously political figures. The guest houses of monasteries, open by the rule of Saint Benedict to all travelers, were gathering points for information. A monk who paid attention to the conversations in the guest house, or who made a point of being hospitable to particularly informative guests, could accumulate intelligence of considerable value to whoever was interested in purchasing it. Section 12. Women in the Walls. Convents, anchoresses, and hidden lives. The history of women in the medieval monastery begins with a paradox. Women were formally excluded from most of the positions of power and authority that made monasteries significant. They could not be ordained priests, they could not preach. In Benedictine communities governed by the rule, the abbess had authority over her nuns, but that authority was circumscribed by male ecclesiastical supervision in ways that the male abbots was not. Women's monasteries were typically poorer than men's, less likely to receive wealthy donations, less likely to be chosen as the burial site of powerful patrons. And yet, the women of medieval monasteries produced some of the most extraordinary intellectual and spiritual work of the entire period. Hildegard of Bingen, born in the Rhineland in 1098, was offered to the monastery of Dissebodenberg at the age of 8 as a tithe of her parents' wealth. She was the 10th child, and the 10th was given to God. She spent the rest of her life in religious communities, eventually founding her own monastery at Rupertsberg near Bingen. In that community, she produced a body of work that staggers the modern mind. Musical compositions of original beauty and complexity, still performed and recorded today. Medical and botanical texts of genuine empirical value. Cosmological and theological writings of daring scope, letters to popes, emperors, and abbots that were among the most forthright and direct communications in an era when directness from women was not encouraged. She described herself as a feather on the breath of God, and the image captures something real about her, a force carried far beyond where any ordinary person would have arrived, powered by something she understood as entirely external to herself. Hildegard was exceptional in degree, but not in kind. The women's religious houses of the medieval period produced writers, musicians, painters, embroiderers, and theologians of real accomplishment.
The embroidery workshops of English convents producing the Opus Anglicanum, the English work that was considered the finest needlework in Europe from roughly 900 to 1350, created objects of such quality that they were given as diplomatic gifts to the papacy and treasured in cathedral vestries across the continent. This work was created by women whose names were often not recorded, working in communities governed by rules that emphasized humility and anonymity.
The anchoress represents perhaps the most extreme form of female monasticism, and the form that has most consistently fascinated later writers and historians. An anchoress, from the Greek anachoresis, meaning withdrawal, was a woman who chose to be enclosed in a small cell, typically attached to the wall of a church, for the rest of her natural life. The enclosure ceremony was formal and elaborate, resembling in some accounts the ceremony of a funeral. The anchoress was symbolically dead to the world, enclosed behind a wall of stone or brick, with only narrow windows connecting her to the outside. One looking into the church so she could follow the Mass, one opening to a small parlour where she could speak briefly with visitors seeking spiritual counsel.
The anchoress was not without resources. Her cell typically included a small garden. She had an attendant or two. She received visitors, sometimes important ones. Julian of Norwich, one of the great spiritual writers of the Middle Ages, was an anchoress who lived enclosed in a cell attached to the Church of St. Julian in Norwich, England, from approximately 1393 until her death some time after 1416. From that cell she produced the Revelations of Divine Love, the first known book written in English by a woman, a work of profound theological originality that, among other things, described God as a mother as well as a father, and insisted with quiet conviction that all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. That sentence has become one of the most famous in English literature. It was written in a cell 10 feet square by a woman who had chosen, for reasons she understood as entirely her own, to be walled into stone for the remainder of her life. The convents of medieval Europe were also, like their male counterparts, places of political complexity. Noble families sent daughters to convents, not always because those daughters felt a call to religious life, but because the family could not afford dowries for all of them, or because a daughter who had been widowed or betrayed needed a safe and respectable place to live. These women brought with them the customs, expectations, and networks of their social class. Abbesses from noble families maintained connections with the secular world that the rule technically prohibited. They managed estates of considerable size. They corresponded with rulers and bishops as equals. A few of them, most notably abbesses of royal foundation houses like Fontevraud in France, where Eleanor of Aquitaine spent her final years, exercised a degree of independent authority that no official structure of the Church was intended to provide for a woman. The interior life that women's religious communities developed, the particular forms of devotional practice, the intense spiritual friendships, the visionary experiences that a remarkable number of medieval holy women reported, was a world that the male hierarchy of the Church simultaneously valued and mistrusted. Female mystics were sought for their wisdom and their reported access to divine knowledge. They were also watched, tested, and sometimes disciplined for speaking truths that male authority found inconvenient. The hidden life of the medieval convent was not merely hidden from the secular world, it was partly hidden from the official church as well. Section 13. The Night Hours. What happened after dark? The bell rings at 2 in the morning. In the winter, this means complete darkness. In the summer, a faint greyness that is not yet dawn. The monks rise from their beds, from their wooden frames stuffed with straw, their coarse linen sheets, their folded habits laid over them for warmth. And they do this immediately, without lingering. The rule is explicit. When the bell sounds, you get up. There is no snooze, there is no negotiation. There is the sound of the bell, and then there is the sound of feet on stone. Vigils, the night office, the first prayer of the day, took place while the rest of the medieval world slept. It lasted perhaps 45 minutes to an hour, a sequence of psalms, readings, and responses in the cold darkness of the church. Candles burned in their holders, the breath of the monks fogged in the air, and then they returned to their beds for a few more hours before lauds, the dawn prayer. This rhythm of interrupted sleep was one of the defining physical experiences of monastic life. Modern sleep science has shown that the idea of a single unbroken 8-hour sleep was itself historically unusual. Most pre-industrial people appear to have slept in 2 distinct periods, with a waking interval in the middle of the night that was used for prayer, thought, or quiet activity. The monastery's vigils office aligned exactly with this natural break in the sleep cycle. The monks who woke for the night office were not, in that sense, being forced against their biology. They were institutionalizing what the body already did.
But the night hours were also the hours of the most complete darkness in a world without electric light. And darkness has always been a space of different possibilities. The monastery at night was not the same as the monastery by day. The abbot slept, the prior slept. The network of supervision that governed the daylight hours relaxed, not entirely, but enough to make the shadows fuller and the possibilities a little wider. The night stairs, the direct access from the dormitory down into the church, so that monks could descend for vigils without going through the main cloister in cold or wet weather, were some of the most intimate architectural spaces in a monastery. A covered stone staircase, narrow, descending in a half-turn from the dormitory level into the south transept of the church. In the absolute dark of a winter night, 20 men descending in silence, guided only by the faint light of a single lamp held by a monk at the bottom of the stairs. The physical closeness, the darkness, the silence, these were conditions under which the rule's careful oversight was most imperfect. The documents of monastic visitations periodically record incidents that took place in the night hours, assignations in the church, conversations in the dormitory after Compline that violated the great silence, monks found absent from their beds at hours when they should have been present. These incidents represent the edges of the life that the night made possible. They are not typical. They are not, in most cases, dramatic. They are small human moments in which the body's needs for warmth, for contact, for the simple comfort of a whispered conversation with someone familiar, overrode the rule's command to silence and isolation.
The night also had a spiritual dimension that went beyond the official liturgy. Certain traditions of monastic prayer, particularly those associated with the more contemplative orders, the Carthusians, who lived in individual cells and met only for the most essential communal liturgies, centered on the night hours as the time of closest approach to God. The silence and darkness were not obstacles, but conditions. The mind emptied of the day's practical concerns, the body relaxed into stillness, the darkness pressing equally on everything. In this state, the contemplative tradition suggested, something beyond ordinary awareness became possible. The visions and mystical experiences reported by medieval monks and nuns occurred disproportionately in the night hours, during vigils, or in the interval before dawn, when the mind hovers between sleep and waking.
Whether these experiences were genuine encounters with the divine or the products of sleep deprivation and suggestion operating on minds trained to expect them is a question that the historical record cannot answer. What it can tell us is that the night in the medieval monastery was not simply the absence of day. It was its own country with its own weather and its own particular truths.
In the autumn of 1536, royal commissioners began arriving at monasteries across England. They came with letters of authority from Thomas Cromwell, who was Henry VIII's chief minister and the primary architect of what would become known as the dissolution of the monasteries. The commissioners carried questionnaires and account books. They assessed the annual income of each house. They investigated the conduct of the monks, looking diligently and sometimes with what seems like a predetermined conclusion for evidence of corruption and scandal. And they began the process of dismantling communities that had, in some cases, been continuously inhabited for 400 years. The dissolution of the monasteries was, between 1536 and 1541, the administrative and legal process by which Henry VIII closed all the Catholic monasteries, priories, convents and friaries in England, Wales and Ireland, seized their wealth and disposed of their assets. The scale of this operation is difficult to fully comprehend. More than 800 religious houses were closed. Around 7,000 monks, friars and nuns were displaced, obliged to find alternative lives with little preparation and in many cases very little support. The treasures that had accumulated in those houses over centuries, gold and silver reliquaries, jeweled vestments, illuminated manuscripts, carved altarpieces, stained glass, lead roofing, timber, stone, were stripped out and either added to the royal treasury, sold to private buyers, or simply left to the weather and the local population's use of the building materials.
Henry's net gain from the dissolution has been estimated at approximately £1.5 million, equivalent to hundreds of millions of pounds today, though historians note that much of this was quickly dissipated in foreign wars and building projects. The lands, which represented the greater part of the monastery's value, were sold cheaply to noble families who formed a new landowning class with a very material interest in ensuring that the monasteries never returned. This was in part the political genius of the operation. By distributing monastic land so widely among the English elite, Henry created a constituency for religious change that extended far beyond his own court. What was lost in the dissolution is harder to quantify than what was gained. The manuscripts were the most irreplaceable loss. English monasteries had been collecting, copying and preserving books for 800 years, and their libraries contained texts that existed nowhere else in the world. The commissioners were not interested in books, they were interested in gold and silver and income-generating property. The great monastic libraries were scattered to the winds. Some books were bought by scholars who understood their value. John Leland, the royal antiquary, spent years travelling the country before the dissolution, cataloguing what was in the monastic libraries and arranging for some of the most important manuscripts to be removed to safety. But Leland was one man against a hurricane. Many manuscripts were burned. Many were sold for use as binding material, their pages used to stiffen the covers of other books. Many simply disappeared.
The physical buildings were treated with similar carelessness.
A monastery that had stood for centuries could be stripped of its roof lead and left open to the sky within weeks. Once the roof was gone, the weather did the rest. The great abbeys of Fountains and Rievaulx in Yorkshire, of Tintern in Wales, of Glastonbury in Somerset, all now magnificent ruins, preserved in their ruined state by later centuries that recognized their historical and aesthetic value, were in 1540 simply abandoned buildings whose stone was available to anyone who wanted to cart it away for building material. Some monasteries hid things before the commissioners arrived. There are persistent stories, some documented and some legendary, of valuables buried in monastery grounds before the dissolution, of manuscripts hidden in walls and under floors, of chalices and reliquaries taken away by faithful lay employees who hoped to preserve them until better times returned. Some of these stories are certainly true. Objects have been found in later centuries in circumstances that suggest deliberate concealment in the 1530s. A remarkable silver chalice found in a wall at a dissolved priory in the north of England in the 19th century. Illuminated manuscripts discovered in the bindings of later books. Small devotional objects turning up in gardens and fields that correspond to the sites of dissolved religious houses.
What the dissolution destroyed in the end was not simply buildings and treasures and libraries. It destroyed a living system, a network of communities that had provided education, hospital care, hospitality, poor relief, and a specific kind of ordered intellectual life for the surrounding populations for generations. The monks and nuns who walked out of their monasteries in the late 1530s and early 1540s were in most cases not sinful or corrupt people. They were people of ordinary human complexity who had built their lives around an institution that was suddenly, within a few years, simply gone. Section 15. Echoes in Stone. What survives today? There are places in the world where you can still walk the same path the monks walked, not metaphorically. The same stones, worn smooth in the same places by the same repeated passage of feet over 8 or 10 or 12 centuries, still carry the weight of whoever chooses to cross them today. The cloister at Fontenay in Burgundy, France, a Cistercian abbey founded by Bernard of Clairvaux in 1118 and now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, is so well preserved that the absence of monks feels temporary, as if they have simply stepped out for a moment and will be back for Vespers. The proportions of the arcade, the quality of the light falling through the arches onto the stone floor, the particular sound that bare stone makes when footsteps cross it in a vaulted space, these things are unchanged. They were like this when Bernard himself walked here. They are like this now. The archaeology of medieval monastic sites has been, over the past century, one of the most productive fields of historical investigation. As dissolved monastery sites were redeveloped, or as ruined abbeys were stabilized and excavated, the physical evidence of monastic life emerged from the ground in forms that documentary sources could never provide. Bones in enormous quantities, giving information about the health, diet, age, and physical characteristics of the people who lived in these communities. Pottery and glass, indicating the range and quality of goods that monks actually used, sometimes rather more sophisticated than the rule implied. Architectural fragments that allowed scholars to reconstruct the appearance of buildings demolished 4 centuries ago. Particularly significant has been the evidence relating to the monastery's industrial and commercial activities. Water mills, fish ponds, tanneries, tile works,
brewing installations. These have been excavated at monastic sites across Europe, providing detailed pictures of the degree to which monasteries were active economic operations rather than simply spiritual ones. The Cistercian abbeys of England were especially important in developing the wool trade that became the foundation of the medieval English economy. Their granges, outlying farms managed by lay brothers, were distributed across vast areas, running flocks of thousands of sheep. The wool these flocks produced was sold directly to Italian merchants, bypassing the local wool fairs that other producers had to use, and the income supported monastic building programs of astonishing ambition.
Medieval manuscripts that survived the dissolution, and tens of thousands did survive, scattered to university libraries, private collections, and eventually to national archives, continue to yield new information to scholars. Digital imaging techniques developed in the late 20th and early 21st centuries have made it possible to read texts that were thought illegible, to recover erased or overwritten passages, to identify the hands of individual scribes across multiple manuscripts, and map the movement of books between institutions. Manuscripts that were thought to contain only one text have been found to contain others, written in a different hand on pages that were scraped and reused, the medieval equivalent of a palimpsest, a text written over an earlier text in the interests of economy or concealment. The medical knowledge preserved in monastic manuscripts has had a particularly interesting afterlife. Modern pharmaceutical research has investigated a number of medieval monastic remedies and found that they have genuine efficacy, that the monks' empirical observations about which plants were useful for which conditions were in many cases correct. The research group at the University of Würzburg in Germany has spent decades sifting through monastic manuscripts from the 8th century onwards, translating plant remedies and investigating their physiological effects. The collaboration with pharmaceutical companies that followed this research has led to the development of products still available today, drawing on knowledge developed and preserved in monastic gardens and infirmaries 1,000 years ago.
The living monasteries that still exist, and there are several hundred Benedictine monasteries operating today, as well as communities of Cistercians, Carthusians, and other orders, carry the same rule that Benedict wrote in his cave near Subiaco around 530. The schedule is the same: 8 prayer offices, work and reading in the hours between. The abbot's authority is the same. The great silence after Compline is the same. The body of a monk rising in the early morning darkness to make his way to the church for vigils is performing the same act that hundreds of thousands of monks have performed in the same buildings, or buildings on the same sites, for more than 1,000 years. This continuity is not nothing. In a world where most institutions change beyond recognition within a generation or two, the monastery represents an extraordinary experiment in persistence. The secrets it has held, the political maneuvering, the hidden books, the human complexities that no rule can fully contain, are part of that persistence too. History without its shadows is not history. It is just the official story.
The monastery we have walked through tonight was never a simple place. It was not the peaceful refuge of popular imagination, though it contained real peace. It was not the den of corruption and vice that Protestant reformers sometimes described, though it contained real human failure. It was something more interesting than either of those things. A community of people trying, over a very long time, to live according to a demanding ideal, and succeeding and failing in equal measure, and leaving behind, in stone and vellum and bone and memory, an extraordinarily rich record of what that effort looked like from the inside. The stone itself is perhaps the most honest witness. Stone does not editorialize. It holds the weight placed on it and reveals the purposes it has been put to with complete indifference to whether those purposes were holy or mundane. The worn threshold of the scriptorium door tells you only that many feet crossed it, not whether they crossed it in gladness or resignation. The smooth stone of the cloister arcade tells you only that generation after generation of sandaled monks walked past in the same direction, not what they were thinking as they walked. The cold floor of the undercroft tells you only that this space was used by the living and the dead in ways that mattered to the people of its time.
What we know from all of it, taken together, is this. The medieval monastery was a place where human beings, in extraordinary numbers, made a serious attempt to build a life around something larger than individual desire, where they organized their days around prayer and silence and work, not because they were forced to, or not only because they were forced to, but because they understood, in the deepest part of themselves, that a life ordered towards something beyond itself was a life of greater meaning than one ordered toward nothing at all, where they preserved knowledge when knowledge was fragile and precious, where they cared for the sick when there was almost nobody else to do so, where they kept records when records were the only thread connecting communities to their past, where they made wine and ale and medicine and music and embroidery, and illuminated manuscripts of breathtaking beauty, doing all of these things within walls that were both their protection and their constraint. And where they failed too, failed to live up to the ideals they professed, failed each other, failed the people who depended on them, hid things that should have been open, and kept secrets that would have been better shared, where they were afraid and lonely and proud, and sometimes cruel, and sometimes deeply, quietly, generously kind. Where they were, in other words, people.
Tonight, if you close your eyes and let the images of this place settle behind them, try to hold this. Somewhere in the world, right now, a bell is ringing. Not an alarm, not a reminder, just the steady bronze voice of a bell in a stone tower, calling the same call it has been making at this hour since before anyone alive was born. And somewhere in the cold dark below that bell, feet are moving across stone floors towards a church that smells of incense and old wood and the particular accumulated devotion of centuries. The monks are rising for vigils. The great silence holds. The candles are lit. And the stone is cool and still, and the books in the library are chained to their shelves in the dark, and the herb garden is sleeping under whatever sky the season brings, and the undercroft is quiet with its dead,
and the cloister is empty, and the bell finishes its ringing, and everything that has ever happened within these walls continues to happen in the only way the past ever can, silently, invisibly, in the weight of the stone that remembers without knowing that it does.
Sleep well. And if these quiet walks through history help your mind find its rest, please do consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. We are a small and growing community here on Heyo, boring history for sleep, and reaching 1,000 subscribers is a goal that means the world to us. If you have a moment, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are listening from tonight and what time the clock says on your wall. Send us what little hype you have left before sleep takes it. We read every one of those comments, and knowing that someone in a different time zone, in a different bed, in a different life, is drifting off to the same slow march through history, that matters more than we can easily say. Section 17. The Refectory. Silence at the Table. There is a particular kind of silence that only a large room full of people eating together can produce. It is a different thing from the silence of an empty room or the silence of a sleeping house. It has weight and texture to it. It breathes. It is made of the small sounds of bowls being placed on wooden tables, of spoons drawn through thick soup, of bread being broken, of swallowed mouthfuls, of the faint creak of a bench under shifting weight. And above all of it, from a raised stone pulpit set into the wall at one end of the long room, the steady voice of a single monk reading aloud. This was the refectory, the dining hall, and the reading that accompanied every meal was not incidental. It was the entire point. The rule of Saint Benedict specified that monks should not eat in silence in the way of simple absence. They should eat in active silence, which meant that the body was being fed while the mind and soul were also being fed, through the words being read from the pulpit. The reader changed with every meal, rotating through the community on a scheduled basis. The texts varied: passages of scripture, chapters from the lives of the saints, readings from the rule itself, excerpts from theological commentaries. On feast days, a longer or more celebratory text might be chosen. The abbot, sitting at the head of the high table facing the room, could signal for more reading or less by a simple gesture. The refectory of a well-appointed medieval monastery was not the sparse, bleak space that the rule might suggest. In the greatest abbeys, at Cluny in Burgundy, at Westminster in London, at St. Gall in Switzerland, the refectory was a magnificent room, its walls sometimes decorated with paintings or frescoes, its windows large and its ceiling high. The tables were arranged around three sides of the room, leaving the center open for the servers, who moved silently among them with platters and jugs. The monks sat on the outer side of the tables, all facing inward, so that no monk's back was to the room, and all were equally visible to the abbot and to each other. The food itself was a matter of considerable theological complexity. The rule forbade the flesh of four-footed animals, except to the sick, a prohibition that theoretically meant no beef, no pork, no mutton. In practice, the interpretation of this rule was subject to considerable creative latitude. The infirmary kitchen, as already noted, was exempt from the prohibition, and a monk who could plausibly claim to be unwell, and after decades of interrupted sleep, cold dormitories, and hard physical labor, there was generally something to point to, might find himself in the infirmary rather than the refectory on the days when the main course was particularly austere.
Some monasteries developed the practice of eating in a separate room called the Misericorde, which was technically outside the formal refectory, and therefore outside the rule's strictest dietary requirements. The Misericorde became, over time, a space of relative relaxation and richer food, a kind of officially sanctioned pressure valve. The serving of wine and ale at table was managed with care. The rule's allowance of roughly half a pint of wine per monk per day was a baseline, not a ceiling. On feast days, the allowance increased. In communities where the monastery's own vineyards or breweries produced in surplus, the cellarer might be generous. At Cluny, the great Benedictine mother house in Burgundy, that had its height in the 11th and 12th centuries, was the largest monastic complex in Europe, the refectory customs were documented in extraordinary detail. Monks of higher standing received their wine in larger vessels. The abbot's table was served with provisions distinguishably better than those of the general community. The rule's insistence on equality was, in practice, modulated by the hierarchical realities of a community that mirrored the social structures of the world outside its walls.
The lavatorium, not a toilet, as the modern sound of the word might suggest, but a washing fountain, stood just outside the refectory door. Before each meal, monks were required to wash their hands. The lavatorium was typically a stone basin set in a niche in the cloister wall, supplied with running water by the monastery's sophisticated plumbing system. Many monasteries had water engineering that was, for its period, remarkably advanced. Channels cut into the hillside above the monastery to bring clean spring water down by gravity, distributed through the buildings by lead pipes to the kitchen, the lavatorium, the infirmary, and the fish ponds. The engineering required to build and maintain these systems was among the monastery's most practically useful skills, and the knowledge of it was, like much of the monastery's technical expertise, kept substantially within the walls. The ritual of the refectory, the silence, the reading, the careful management of food and drink, was an exercise in collective self-discipline that ran meal by meal for the entire monastic life of every person in the community. It was designed to prevent precisely what communal eating most naturally produces: conversation, laughter, gossip, the ordinary social warmth of people sharing food together. Whether it succeeded is a different question. The visitation records include reports of monks who talked at table in violation of the rule, and the sign language that developed in many monasteries as a way of communicating the most essential needs without technically speaking, a closed fist with thumb inside for bread, a hooked finger for ale, suggests both the absurdity and the genuine inventiveness of people trying to live within a system that did not quite account for all of human nature.
Before any of this was possible, before the prayer schedule and the scriptorium and the refectory and the silence, there was the gate, a physical gate in a physical wall, with a porter on the inside and the world on the outside, and a person standing at it who wanted, for reasons that were their own, to cross through. The process of becoming a monk in a medieval Benedictine monastery was not quick. The rule of Saint Benedict was explicit about this. Anyone who genuinely desired to follow the monastic way should be made to wait, not out of cruelty, but as a test of sincerity. The monastery was not supposed to be a refuge from difficulty, an easy escape from a hard life. It was supposed to be, in the words of the rule, a school for the Lord's service, and schools, Benedict implies, should not lower their standards to attract students.
The first stage was the novitiate. A novice was someone who had been admitted to the monastery on a probationary basis, typically for a period of 1 year, though in practice the novitiate could last longer if the novice master or the abbot had doubts about the candidate's suitability. During this year, the novice lived in a separate part of the monastery,
under the direct supervision of the novice master, who was responsible for his formation. He attended the prayer offices. He performed manual work. He was taught the rule, which was read to him 3 times over the course of the year, with each reading followed by the question, "Can you keep this?" It was an honest question. The rule was not an easy document, and the monastery wanted to be sure that the person committing to it understood what they were committing to. At the end of the novitiate, if both the novice and the community agreed, the formal profession of vows took place. The monk knelt before the altar and pronounced in a clear voice his vows of obedience, stability, and conversion of life. The vow of stability was particularly significant and particularly unusual. It bound the monk not just to the monastic way of life in general, but to this particular monastery, these particular walls, this particular community of people for the rest of his natural life. He would not wander. He would not seek a different house if this one became difficult. He would remain.
The document on which the vows were written was then placed on the altar in the presence of the whole community as a witness. Some monasteries required the new monk to sign it or to make his mark if he could not write. And then the community received him, formally, with the embrace of the abbot and the chapter, and his old identity was sealed away behind the gate through which he had come. The clothes he arrived in were taken. He received the habit, the long woolen robe, belted at the waist, with a cowl for the choir offices, and a scapular, a shorter garment worn over the habit for work. That would be the only outer garment he would wear for the rest of his life. He received new sandals. In some monasteries he received a new name, a saint's name chosen by the abbot or by lot, as a sign of his new identity. The person who had knocked at the gate was in a formal and intended sense gone. Someone else now lived in these walls. What actually happened to the person inside that formal transformation is what the history is really about. The novice who came from a wealthy family brought with him beneath his habit the habits of mind of his social class, the expectation of certain foods, certain standards of physical comfort, certain assumptions about his own importance. The novice who came from a poor family brought his own set of assumptions and found himself living alongside men of education and social standing who had renounced privileges the poor novice had never possessed in the first place. The monastery was, in theory, a leveler. The rule said explicitly that no distinction of rank should exist within the community, that birth counted for nothing in the monastery's hierarchy. In practice, as in every human community, the theory and the reality maintained a complicated and not always honest relationship. The gate remained, always the gate, at the outer wall, between this world and the other. Monks who needed to travel outside the monastery for legitimate purposes required the abbot's permission, and were expected to conduct themselves according to the rule, even when no one from the monastery was watching. Monks who left without permission, who simply walked out, as some did, were classified as fugitives, and the rule described the procedure for receiving them back if they returned. It was characteristically both firm and merciful. The returning monk was to be received back up to 3 times, but on the 3rd return his penance was severe. The 4th departure was a point of no return.
The gate was also the boundary through which the world entered the monastery. The porter, a senior and trusted monk stationed at the gatehouse, had the responsibility of managing this flow. He received guests and directed them to the guest house. He accepted the donations that were left at the gate by people seeking the monk's prayers. He turned away people whose presence was not appropriate.
and he was, in this capacity, the monastery's interface with the world it had theoretically left behind, the person who stood at the precise boundary between the closed life and the open one, and who every day negotiated what crossed it in either direction. Section 19. The Calefactory, the one warm room. In a monastery where the dominant architectural materials were stone and cold air, where the prayer offices took place in an unheated church and the scriptorium forbade open flames near the manuscripts, where the dormitory was lit but not warmed, and the cloister was open to whatever weather the season chose to deliver, there was typically one room that offered warmth as a specific and designated feature of its purpose. This was the calefactory, from the Latin calefacere, meaning to make warm, also called the warming room. The calefactory was a concession to basic physiology that even the strictest interpretation of the rule had to accommodate. People working in cold conditions become unable to work effectively. Monks who had spent hours in the unheated church for the night offices, or who had been laboring in the fields or garden in winter weather, needed to restore the circulation to their extremities before they could usefully continue with the tasks that required fine motor control: writing, embroidering, illuminating. The warming room provided this restoration. It had a fireplace, sometimes a large one. It had benches arranged around it, and it was one of the few spaces in the monastery where something approaching informal social ease was possible. The rule did not specify conversation in the calefactory, but it did not specify silence there either, in the way it specified silence in the dormitory after compline or at meals in the refectory. This ambiguity was in practice an opening. The warming room was one of the places where something closer to normal human social interaction could occur, where an older monk might speak quietly to a younger one about something other than the liturgy, where a group sitting together by the fire might exchange words that were not strictly necessary, but were deeply human. In winter, the calefactory was crowded. Monks rotated through it in groups. Each group allocated a period of time to warm themselves before returning to their duties. The fire was tended carefully. A dying fire in the one warm room of the monastery was a serious failure of the monk responsible for its maintenance. Wood or charcoal was the fuel. In some monasteries in peat-producing regions, blocks of dried peat were used. The smell of peat smoke in stone corridors is a very specific smell, and one that anyone who has spent time in surviving medieval buildings in Ireland, Scotland, or northern England will recognize immediately. The social dynamics of the calefactory were inevitably reflective of the monastery's broader social dynamics. The seniors sat closest to the fire. The juniors sat at the outer edges, closer to the cold. If the abbot appeared, the room's atmosphere changed, the informal ease contracting back toward the formal posture that his presence required. The calefactory could not escape the hierarchy any more than the refectory could. But it provided, within that hierarchy, a space of slightly greater warmth, not only physical warmth, but the warmth of ordinary human proximity that the monastery's other spaces systematically denied. On the coldest nights of deep winter, the calefactory was sometimes kept open longer than usual. Monks who were genuinely chilled after the pre-dawn offices, whose hands were too cold to manage the fine work of the scriptorium, would be permitted an extended period at the fire. These concessions, small, practical, acknowledging the body's limits, were among the small mercies that distinguished a well-run monastery from a brutal one. The rule was demanding, but Benedict had always intended it to be demanding in the service of genuine human flourishing, not in the service of spectacle or punishment. The abbot who understood this distinction was the abbot whose community, over time, remained intact and functional. The abbot who did not tended to preside over communities that fractured, that sent monks out through the gate and did not see them return.
Rievaulx was founded in 1132 by Cistercian monks from Clairvaux in France, sent by Bernard himself. Within 20 years of its founding, it housed over 300 monks and 500 lay brothers, a community so large that it was, by any measure, a small town. It owned land across Yorkshire and into County Durham. It had granges, outlying farms, from which the produce of thousands of acres flowed back to the valley. Its church, rebuilt in the mid-12th century, was one of the finest examples of early Gothic architecture in England, long and soaring, with pointed arches that were then a new idea, their upward thrust expressing something about the direction prayer was supposed to go. All of this was destroyed between 1538 and the years immediately following, when the monastery was dissolved on the orders of Henry VIII. The lead was stripped from the roof, the stone was carted away for building material in the surrounding villages and farms. Look at the walls of barns and field boundaries in the Rye Valley even today, and you will find occasionally dressed stone that was cut by Cistercian masons in the 12th century. The monks dispersed into a world that had been profoundly reorganized in their absence. Some took secular work, some received small pensions from the crown, some vanished from the historical record entirely. What remained was the stone that was too heavy to move and too deeply embedded to extract easily. The foundations, the great arches of the nave arcade, some still standing to their full height. The outline of the chapter house floor, marked now by the low stubs of its walls. The course of the water channels that the monks had cut through the valley to supply their buildings, still traceable in the landscape as slight variations in the level of the ground. Rievaulx is an extreme case in terms of scale, but not in terms of pattern. Across England, Wales and Ireland, and across France, Germany, Spain, and the rest of Europe, where dissolution and warfare and the passage of time did their work, the ruins of monasteries stand as the most substantial surviving architecture of the Middle Ages. They are more common than castles. They are often better preserved, because their walls were thicker and their stone was cut with more care. And they carry, in their proportions and their spaces, a direct transmission of the ideas that built them. The belief that space organized according to sacred geometry, oriented toward the east, where the sun rose and where Jerusalem lay, built to a scale that made the human body feel appropriately small, could do something to the minds of the people who inhabited it.
Whether you believe that or not, whether you find the idea of architecture as a spiritual instrument compelling or simply interesting, it is worth sitting with the fact that the people who built these places believed it absolutely. They organize their entire lives around the idea that physical space could shape interior experience, that stone arranged in certain ways, in certain proportions, oriented in certain directions, could help a person approach something they understood as God. And they built across a period of about 400 years, from roughly 1050 to 1450, on a scale that we have not attempted since. Not because the technology is unavailable, but because the faith that powered it is not what it was. The stones remember this. They hold the impression of the intention that shaped them, the way a very old piece of furniture holds the shape of the hands that used it. You do not need to share the faith to feel the weight of it. You only need to stand in the ruins at the right time of day, when the light is particular and the wind has stopped, and let the scale of what was lost settle around you, like the stone dust that is always, quietly, still falling. There is something in these places that does not yield to the ordinary categories of history and ruin, something that the dissolution could not fully dissolve. Not a ghost, not a supernatural claim, just the particular quality of attention that accumulated in these spaces over centuries, preserved somehow in the stone, the way a note of music is preserved in the shape of the instrument that played it. And on the coldest mornings, when the mist is still in the valley, and the light hasn't quite committed to the day yet, and the ruins are quiet enough that you can hear the river from wherever you are standing, on those mornings you might almost hear, at the edge of what is audible, the bell, just once, low and bronze and steady, the way it has always been, calling whoever is listening to come to prayer. And you might stand there for a moment longer than you intended, not because you are religious or because the history has made you sentimental, but simply because the call still has something in it, something about the value of stillness, of attention, of organizing your day around something more enduring than the urgency of your own concerns, something about the strange, deep human need to be part of a rhythm that is larger than your own heartbeat. The stones remember, and in their remembering, something persists. Thank you for listening. Sleep well. The monastery is quiet, the bell is still, and the long night stretches on ahead, calm and undemanding. Let it carry you.